This analysis will look at the associations between the female suicide rate, gender wage gap, broken down by geographical region. The dataset was taken from two separate sources. The first was suicide data from the WHO, covers almost every country in the world, and is considered the most prominent and most used dataset for global suicide data. Wage information and economic data was taken from the International Labor Organization that covered 115 countries. So because I was putting these two together, I did have to reduce the final data set to those 115 countries. However, he still had good geographical coverage and data from every part of the world. This is table 1. It's a univariate analysis. You can see that where there was a difference in wages for the same occupational field, men had an advantage 87.9% of the time. Women had an advantage 12.1% of the time. Broken down by separate job categories, you can see there's a good balance between these separate categories here, most of them close to about 10%. There's only one, well, there's actually two that were smaller, armed forces at about 3% and legislators and senior officials at about 3%, but that actually makes perfect sense. That's fine. There were some categories where females had an advantage pretty consistently, which was a nice surprise. There's also a huge difference in the geographic breakdown of this. Only 12.5% of the female wage advantage countries were Europe and North American. Almost 40% of them were in Latin American and the Caribbean. And overall, that region was closest to achieving gender parity in wages. Second analysis was also univariate, broke down suicide rates, and they were categorized into one of three categories. The first was low risk, which is about 45% of the population. The next was average at about 38%. And the final category was high risk, 17.3%. Again, we see here that for the countries where there was for the occupational fields by country, where there was a advantage for women in wages, those countries were less likely to be high risk for female suicide. So this particular paper was looking at risk factors and not protective factors, but this looks like the female wage gap was a bit of a protective factor in this instance. So there's a long list of issues and concerns with suicide data collection, particularly worldwide, varying quality between countries and regions. This is a good example of something that is just an issue. You see here there's 414 data points from Northern Africa and Western Asia. Out of the 414, only 19 were average risk and 0 were high risk. Now that's just not plausible, so that's an obvious example of where there's definitely underreporting in suicide deaths. So for the last table, the multivariate logistic regression, since that's a dichotomous variable, I split that between, instead of the three categories, as two categories: high risk, yes or no. This population of high risk accounted for 18.49%. Again, though, there was a protective factor for the female wage advantage. Those numbers actually look almost exactly the same as the analysis with the three categories. So far and away, overall, the region that had the lowest female suicide rates, other than the ones that were suspect, was Latin American and the Caribbean. As far as the risk factor for suicide, female suicide rates, geographical region, by far the worst was sub-Saharan Africa. It was about 13% of the population overall, and about 23% of the high-risk population. And you can see that the odds ratio is fairly high. But the main hypothesis and the main focus of this was suicide rate for females broken down by gender wage gap. So the male advantage did show an association with a higher risk of female suicide, but the odds ratio, the 95% confidence interval, was less than 1 at the lowest value. So that means that the result was not statistically significant. It did trend in that direction, but overall, that hypothesis was not supported.